Greetings, comrades! Let's think about which room in your apartment is the most important. Is it the bedroom where you spend most of your time? The kitchen? Maybe the bathroom? Today we are going to talk about an element that's present in almost every apartment, but which we rarely consider to be a cultural phenomenon. Balconies. They are private yet public, open yet secluded. A balcony is a unique transitional zone, connecting the interior of your apartment with the outside world, and it can reveal a lot about its owner. Of course, they vary greatly from country to country. In Southern Europe, in France and Italy, a balcony is a place to smoke, drink coffee and even dry your laundry. In China, however, they are enclosed like cages and used for storage. In Britain, they are almost non-existent. So what are balconies like in Russia, and what are their unique features? How popular are they given the harsh Russian climate? Let's find out. You might ask whether such a trivial thing as a balcony is worthy of a separate video. Are we really going to watch a 15-minute video on balconies? It's just a couple of square meters. However, I believe that small everyday details like that provide the best insight into the life of any country. And balconies are a pan-Russian phenomenon. Russians love balconies with all their hearts, there's no denying it. As children, we go out onto them to admire the view and breathe fresh air. And as we get older, we go out to smoke. Often the most important conversations take place on balconies. Long and calm in summer and brief in winter. According to recent polls, 80% of Russians have a balcony in their home. In fact, you don't even need polls. Just look at a typical Russian apartment block and you'll notice that balconies and loggias are everywhere, and that they look curiously artisanal, as if each resident has added their own unique box filled with God knows what to a ready-made model house. And in fact, that's not far from the truth. But why are they so different in Russia and neighboring countries compared to other parts of the world? How did this elegant architectural element first turn into an open-air storage space, and then into a canvas for unbridled creativity? To understand this, let's start with some historical background. Balconies have existed for millennia and gradually became an integral part of world architecture. Some of them have become landmarks, like Cape Town City Hall where Mandela spoke, or the Vatican one where the Pope blesses the faithful. Strictly speaking, that's a loggia, not a balcony, a completely different thing. A balcony extends beyond the facade, while a loggia is built into it. But today, for the sake of simplicity, we will call them all balconies. In Russia, balconies emerged as an architectural feature relatively late, initially appearing only in royal residences. They were used for social events and to observe city life. It was not until the end of the 19th century, when доходные дома were constructed, that balconies became widespread. In the center of Moscow, you can still see some historic buildings with prefabricated cast iron balconies featuring openwork metal or plaster railings. However, it is immediately apparent when you look at such a building that having a balcony was a privilege, and not every apartment had one. In the first half of the 20th century, residents of large cities did not have the luxury of relaxing on their balconies, as housing was in short supply. They huddled in barracks, communal apartments and dormitories. Even when designing the famous Stalinkas, balconies were not considered functional areas. If balconies were included, they played a more decorative and ideological role, demonstrating grandeur and monumentality. Interestingly, the very first versions of Khrushchevkas had no balconies at all. They were simple living boxes made of prefabricated panels, but later on they did appear, and were stereotypically minimalist. A concrete slab with a metal railing, and there you had your balcony. Maximum practicality with a minimum of materials. But there was one problem with these balconies. You could see everything on them. I mean, everything. It was considered improper for a Soviet citizen to appear in public in their underwear for no reason. Therefore, in subsequent series of Khrushchevkas, it was often decided to cover the lower perimeter of the grating with something. The choice fell on aluminum plates, which are light enough that the balcony itself would not collapse and do not rust. Although some claim that the partitions were made of asbestos cement, which is not very healthy. On the subject of collapse, have you noticed the old Soviet balconies in Russian cities that appear to be leaning outwards, as if they are about to fall? Many people think that they have simply warped over time. Even my grandparents' apartment had one, and I was too scared to go out on it because I was pretty sure it would collapse. But 30 years have passed and it's still standing. The truth is that balconies in Soviet times were built at an angle on purpose. This was to prevent small, unglazed balconies from accumulating moisture during rainy and snowy seasons. By the way, not all residents, even those in fashionable Khrushchevkas, had access to balconies. First-floor residents did not have them. Was this discrimination or an economic decision? Both, but only partially. Firstly, it was a security measure to protect against thieves, and secondly, it was a requirement for the buildings to be connected to the gas network. Gas required pipes, which were attached to the exterior walls of the building on the ground floor. In theory, the balcony was part of a grand humanistic idea. It was intended to provide Soviet citizens with something they desperately needed: a little personal space, some fresh air, and the connection with nature amidst the concrete jungle. It was a small private terrace, a place for morning exercise or evening tea. But Soviet reality quickly turned this dream into the prose of life. Apartments were tiny, there were no storage rooms, and people accumulated more and more possessions. The balcony became the obvious place to store it all. We must not forget the Russian cultural code. We are used to keeping things in reserve rather than throwing them away. Thus, the balcony became an integral part of Soviet life. It was a strategic storage space where everything that was too good to throw away might come in handy was kept. In winter, it turned into a natural refrigerator. In summer, it became a mini garden for growing seedlings and onions. However, there were other ways to use the balcony, such as going out for a smoke or chatting with neighbors in the courtyard. Children also loved balconies for their mischief. After all, there is no better place to throw a bag of water, an egg or a potato at passers-by. It is important to understand that in the original design, the vast majority of these balconies were open. Glazing was not provided for. Moreover, during the Soviet era, there was a ban on glazing balconies. Yes, even in our harsh climate. Soviet citizens were supposed to be open to the world, the sun and the community. Doctors were also against it, as it worsened ventilation and prevented sunlight from entering. However, some people still did it. The climate and everyday life dictated their own rules. Over time, Khrushchevkas were replaced by Brezhnevkas and open balconies were replaced by loggias. Their size increased significantly and they became much easier to glaze. Nevertheless, Soviet loggias have their own peculiarities. And the issue here is not the needs of residents, but safety requirements. According to Soviet and Russian building codes, balconies and loggias serve a simple function. They provide an additional escape route in case of fire. These must be provided from a height of 15 meters above ground level. That is why in many Brezhnev-era buildings you can see strange hatches in the floor and even staircases connecting apartments to each other on the loggias. Don't be alarmed, these are simply additional fire exits. Years go by, typical Soviet buildings are a thing of the past, but the Russian love for balconies has not diminished, it has only evolved. The most obvious trend of the last 30 years has been the widespread glazing and insulation of balconies. Owners no longer want balconies to be just a storage space for half-forgotten items, they want to increase the usable area and create a warm loggia. Decades of living in cramped conditions have taught people to value every square meter. Glazing and insulating a balcony and connected to a room is a small personal victory over typical construction, and a way to reclaim a little more living space from the system. A glazed balcony can be transformed into an additional living space. You could put a table there to create a dining area, or you could create a mini greenhouse, a workspace, a sports area, or a safe space for children. In fact, balconies and loggias are becoming a lifestyle element and an important criterion for buyers when choosing a home, rather than just an utilitarian option. According to recent opinion polls, almost 60% of buyers cited balconies as a priority when purchasing an apartment. There is also a more radical option for using balconies and loggias: integrating them into rooms. People invest a lot of money in insulated tiny balconies and installing double-glazed windows, only to then remove the window and door unit that separates the balcony from the room. Often heating radiators are also moved to balconies, or water-heated floors are installed there, which by the way is common but illegal. But such solutions look impressive and the room really does become larger. Many people put their computers there. This has become especially popular during the widespread shift to remote working. So, what makes Russian balconies different from those in other countries? In Europe and the US, balconies are often seen as aesthetic features, places to relax and enjoy the view. In southern countries, balconies are part of the facade and are often decorated with wrought iron railings. Laundry is dried outside, and the architecture requires a decorative touch. In Russia, however, functionality comes first. European balconies are extroverted and open to the city. The Russian balcony, on the other hand, is introverted and closed off, protecting the inner world of the apartment. They have become an extension of the home and the border zone, a small sovereign enclave. And of course, the scale is different. Soviet housing developments produced hundreds of thousands of almost identical balconies, and this is also a feature of the post-Soviet era. Unfortunately, however, there is a certain trend in modern Russian mass construction, a gradual move away from balconies. In Moscow, the number of properties without balconies exceeds those with them. In the budget segment, such options account for up to 80%. Instead, individual storage rooms have begun to appear more frequently in new buildings, designed both inside apartments and outside residential premises. Developers usually justify this with the European desire for minimalism and the intention not to spoil the appearance of buildings. Well, that makes sense. However, the impact on the appearance would not be so significant if residents kept their balconies and loggias in their original condition. However, experience shows that this rarely happens. Even if balconies initially fit well into the overall architectural concept, the facade of the buildings inevitably begins to look like a hodgepodge very soon, especially if some residents have designed their balconies based on their aesthetic sensibilities. Because of this, balconies, or rather how they are used and modified, often become a bone of contention between neighbors. Residents complain about illegal additions, management companies insist on a uniform facade, and city authorities insist on preserving the historical appearance. Often, this is less a legal dispute than a conflict of ideas about privacy versus public aesthetics. Some believe that glazing makes a house more comfortable, while others believe that it distorts the architecture. What should residents of the ground floor do, for example? They want security, so they put bars on their balcony windows, but this is not very aesthetically pleasing. It is also important to understand that balcony culture varies greatly even within the post-Soviet space. In some Ukrainian and southern Russian cities, for instance, balconies resembling bus or trolleybus windows are popular. There is even a rumor that these balconies were made from the leftover windows of bus factories that went bankrupt after the collapse of the USSR, which is not true, by the way. Also in southern Russia, large-scale unauthorized balcony extensions are widespread, a phenomenon that originated in Georgia. In the 1990s, there were even construction companies in Tbilisi who manufactured metal frames for balcony extensions. These were known as kamikaze loggias. This trend has produced masterpieces such as the electric train driver's balcony or Tutankhamon's balcony, or simply some giga balconies. There are also smaller-scale renovations, such as residents creating windows or mini stairs for their pets, which look quite cute. These could be labeled as architectural vandalism, or they could be viewed as an attempt to customize and domesticate the faceless panel boxes that people find themselves living in. Nevertheless, architects and urban preservation activists are calling for rules that would enable people to improve their living conditions without affecting the appearance of the street. Today, the era of chaotic self-construction seems to be coming to an end. In modern buildings, those that still have balconies, the design already incorporates glazing. This immediately establishes a uniform style for the facade and eliminates the need for owners to improve anything. There are also emerging design solutions, such as modular balconies for renovation, eco-friendly facades with greenery, and commercial projects where owners combine loggias into collective mini terraces. It may sound strange, but the history of balconies provides an accurate reflection of our country's history. It was characterized by a desire for standardization and total scarcity. Then came an explosion of individualism, sometimes wild and clumsy. Now we are entering an era of seeking harmony between the personal and the public, between function and aesthetics. What will happen next? I hope the trend of converting balconies into working and warm spaces continues, while the trend of not having balconies at all disappears. After all, the absence of a balcony can affect not only everyday life, but also the psychological perception of housing. A balcony is often perceived as a space for privacy, an opportunity to step outside the apartment without leaving it. The absence of one can cause a feeling of confinement, especially in large cities where access to parks and green spaces is limited. Those who work from home may also feel uncomfortable, as being unable to change their surroundings in just a few steps can reduce productivity and increase stress. Simply stepping out onto the balcony is not only a way to get some fresh air, but also a means of mental switching. And losing this outlet in today's world will be very difficult. By the way, how are balconies used in your country? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you next time. And, as always, a huge shout out to my biggest supporters: Елизавета Захарова, Kirill Klimuk, Ziman Böze, Peter Illich, Marina Holiday, Lyudmila Ilyanova, and one more member who wished to remain anonymous.